The endless hum of machinery echoed through the towering walls of the Hive city, a symphony of industry that had not ceased for centuries. In the depths of this vast, sprawling metropolis, where the sky was hidden behind layers of soot and pollution, there was no room for mercy. The Hive was a place built on the backs of the countless, nameless workers who served the Imperium without question. They toiled day and night, their labor feeding the insatiable hunger of the Imperial war machine. The Hive World was a prison, and Malcus had been born inside it, never knowing anything but the relentless cycle of work, fatigue, and numbness. Malcus stood at his post, his hands covered in the black grime of the machines he had spent his entire life repairing. The scent of burning oil and molten metal filled the air, choking his lungs with each breath. His eyes, bloodshot from years of sleeplessness, glanced over the sea of faces that surrounded him, fellow workers, all of them indistinguishable from one another in their exhaustion, their faces blank with the resignation of those who knew their lives had already been written for them. No one in the Hive questioned their fate. They couldn't afford to. The Imperium demanded absolute obedience, and in return, it granted only the most basic of existences. The walls around Malcus were a suffocating grey, pocked with years of industrial soot and the marks of time's unrelenting march. The Hive stretched far into the distance, a towering edifice of metal, stone, and concrete that seemed to pierce the very sky. The air was thick, almost gelatinous, with the acrid stench of factory exhaust and the suffocating weight of the Hive's atmosphere. Above them, the dim lights of the Hive flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the streets. Here, there was no night, no day, just an eternal twilight, a sickly yellow hue that bathed everything in its sickly glow. Malcus's shift had begun hours ago, and the machines never stopped. The hum of their gears, the clank of their pistons, the hiss of steam, all merged into a single, unbroken sound that reverberated in his bones. He didn't know what time it was anymore. Time in the Hive had long since become irrelevant. There was only the work, the endless, mind-numbing work that consumed every hour of every day. He had long forgotten what it felt like to be anything other than a cog in this massive, grinding machine. His body was nothing more than an extension of the machines he serviced, rough, scarred, and unfeeling. Malcus's hands worked automatically as he adjusted a valve on the massive press in front of him. The machinery groaned under the weight of its own movements, but it was still functional. For now, it was always just barely functional. The Hive's systems were ancient, held together by little more than willpower and desperation. No one dared stop the flow of industry, not when the Imperium's vast armies were constantly in need of new weapons, new soldiers, new resources. The factories of the Hive World could not afford to fail, not for a single moment. As he worked, Malcus's thoughts drifted, not for the first time, to the question that had been plaguing him for as long as he could remember. What was the point of it all? What was the purpose of his life, of his endless toil? He had never known anything else. He had been born in the Hive, raised in the suffocating shadows of its spires. His parents, like all workers, had been nameless, faceless. They had lived, worked, and died in the Hive, and now their ashes were lost in the wind. They had never been anything more than fuel for the great furnace that powered the Imperium. But now, something stirred within him, a feeling that he could not name, something alien and terrifying. It was a flicker of awareness, a sense that he was more than just a machine. It was a fleeting thought, a whisper in the back of his mind that told him that he was not meant to live like this, that there was something more out there, something beyond the iron walls of the Hive. The thought was so foreign, so strange, that Malcus immediately pushed it away. It wasn't possible. This was his life. This was his purpose. The Imperium had given him life, and in return, it demanded his labor. There was no room for anything else. The workers served, and the Imperium thrived. That was the way of things, and it had always been that way. Yet the thought lingered, gnawing at him. He glanced around at the other workers. They moved with the same mechanical precision, their faces devoid of any emotion. They were ghosts, trapped in their own servitude, just as he had been. But Malcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something they were all missing. They had all been taught to worship the Emperor, to revere the Imperium as the shining beacon of humanity's future. But what did they truly know of the Emperor, of the Imperium's true nature? What did they really understand about the price of their survival? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt that sent shockwaves through the floor beneath him. Malcus staggered, barely keeping his balance as the entire sector seemed to tremble. The machines around him hummed louder, their gears grinding with a strange urgency, as if they had a mind of their own. Malcus's heart began to race, and his hand instinctively gripped the edge of the massive press. This wasn't normal. The Hive had never reacted like this before. The tremors continued, growing stronger, as though something unseen was stirring deep within the Hive's foundations. Around him, the other workers barely reacted. They had seen disturbances like this before: malfunctions, power surges, the occasional breakdown. It was nothing new, but Malcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. He glanced up at the towering machinery overhead, his eyes narrowing as he tried to locate the source of the disturbance. And then, it came a low, resonating hum, unlike anything he had ever heard before. It wasn't from the machines, it was something else, something alive. A voice, distant but clear, echoed through his mind, reverberating in the very core of his being. "Malcus, your time has come." And Malcus froze, his blood running cold as the voice penetrated the very fabric of his soul. He had never heard anything like it before. It was the voice of power, of something greater than anything he had ever known. For a moment, the world around him seemed to fade away, the hum of the machines silencing as the voice continued to resonate in his mind. "You are more than what they have told you. You are more than this. M0. His breath caught in his throat as the weight of the words hit him like a physical blow. His heart pounded in his chest, and his vision blurred as the world around him seemed to twist and warp. The hum of the Hive, the clanging of metal, the smells of oil and grease, they all faded, leaving only the voice that echoed through the vast emptiness. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the voice stopped. The machines resumed their incessant noise, the vibrations beneath his feet fading into the background. Malcus stood frozen, his mind reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Had it been real? Was it a hallucination, a side effect of the constant strain he had been under? Or had something truly awakened inside the Hive? Something ancient and powerful? He didn't know, but for the first time in his life, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of hope, a spark of possibility. The Emperor was waking, the Imperium was waking, and nothing would ever be the same again. Malcus stood still, his heart hammering in his chest, even as the hum of the machines around him returned to their monotonous rhythm. The moment had passed, or so it seemed. The industrial cacophony of the Hive swallowed the strange echo of the voice, but the weight of those words still lingered in his mind like an oppressive fog. "You are more than what they have told you." He clenched his fists, feeling the rough texture of his worn-out work gloves biting into his skin. The words of the voice, so rich with power, still rang in his ears. The Hive, this steel and concrete prison that had been his entire life, felt different somehow. The walls seemed to close in around him, and for the first time, Malcus saw them for what they truly were. Not the sturdy fortresses of industrial might, but the iron shackles of oppression. His entire existence, the endless grind of the machines, the insatiable need for resources to fuel the Imperium's war effort, was it all just a cycle of misery, designed to keep the masses chained to the will of those in power? A sharp, metallic screech echoed through the room as a malfunctioning press clattered to a halt. The noise of the machines ground to a sudden stop, and the workers, those around him, didn't flinch. They simply moved to the next task, their faces devoid of life, their movements mechanical. They had long ago ceased to question anything, but Malcus wasn't like them anymore. He had heard the voice, "Your time has come." He wasn't sure what it meant, but the words had a power, a truth that felt like it was digging into the very marrow of his bones. Was it the Emperor himself? Was this some kind of divine intervention, Or had something else awakened in the hive, in him? The thought made him dizzy, as though the world itself was unspooling at the edges. "Malcus!" a voice barked, dragging him back to reality. He turned to see Brother Magnus, a grizzled, older worker, his face just as scarred and grim as Malcus's own. Magnus's one good eye narrowed, his thick brow furrowing in annoyance. "What are you staring at, fool?" Magnus spat, his voice rough like broken stone. "Get back to work before the overseers see you slacking off." Malcus blinked, the cold reality of the hive slamming back into his mind. The overseers, those enforcers of discipline, the ones who kept the workers in line, were always watching. Any hesitation, any weakness, could bring swift punishment. Yet, for the first time, the looming threat of the overseers didn't seem so important. Malcus returned to his task, but his mind was elsewhere. The thought of the voice continued to gnaw at him, growing louder with each passing moment. He could feel something stirring inside him, something new, something dangerous. His fingers tightened on the valve controls, the simple task becoming a strange metaphor for his growing restlessness. The machinery in front of him, the machines he had repaired so many times, felt different now. They were no longer just tools, they were part of the system that bound him, part of the chains that kept the workers enslaved. As Malcus worked, his thoughts wandered again. He had always known that there was something wrong with the Hive World, something more sinister, lurking beneath the surface. The stories passed down from the older workers, the whispers of strange happenings and forgotten rituals, these were the things he had never questioned, the things that had always seemed distant and unimportant. After all, who was Malcus to challenge the status quo? He was nothing more than a worker, a cog in the machine of the Imperium. But now, after hearing that voice, after feeling the stirrings of a forgotten power inside himself, he was beginning to question everything. He worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of his task almost soothing in its predictability, but the unease gnawed at him. His hands moved almost mechanically, fixing broken parts, adjusting faulty systems, but his mind was elsewhere. The voice, the strange sense of awareness, it was like a crack had appeared in his worldview, and through that crack, a flood of new possibilities had begun to pour in. Then it happened again. The tremors returned, shaking the foundations of the hive with a force that felt almost deliberate. The machines sputtered, their gears grinding to a halt, and the faint, eerie hum returned, this time stronger, more insistent. The workers around Malcus paused for a moment, their blank expressions unwavering as they continued their labor, unaffected by the tremors. It was as if they had no sense of the disturbance, no awareness of the power that was slowly creeping into the hive. But Malcus could feel it in his bones. It was the same sensation he had felt before, only now it was more potent, more alive. He stepped back from his workstation, glancing around. No one seemed to notice, no one except him. The air had changed, thickened, as if the very atmosphere of the hive was being altered. Malcus felt the hairs on his neck rise, the oppressive weight of the hive city pressing down on him more than ever before. The voice spoke again, louder this time, as though it had been waiting for him to listen. "You are more than this, Malcus. It is time to remember what you have forgotten." Malcus's breath caught in his throat. The voice, it was inside his head, echoing through his very being. He felt his pulse quicken as the words pierced through the veil of his mind, forcing him to confront a reality he had never dared to consider. Was he truly more than this? Was there something hidden within him, something buried deep beneath the layers of exhaustion and despair? The thought felt dangerous. It was a seed, a thought that had been planted in the soil of his mind, and now it was beginning to sprout. But what if it was a lie? What if everything he had known, his work, his place in the hive, his loyalty to the Imperium, was just a shadow, a construct designed to keep him in line, to keep him obedient? The tremors grew stronger, and this time Malcus felt them in his chest. His heartbeat seemed to sync with the shaking, as if the entire hive was alive with a force he could no longer deny. And then, in the distance, he heard it louder than the hum of the machinery, clearer than the tremors shaking the walls. It was the sound of something ancient, something far beyond the grasp of the hive workers, something that had been dormant for millennia. It was the sound of a a summons that transcended time and space. It was the Emperor. Malcus felt his blood run cold as the realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The Emperor, the immortal god-king of humanity, was waking. The Imperium, the vast, decaying empire that spanned the stars, was on the verge of something momentous. And for the first time in his life, Malcus understood that his existence, his very being, was tied to something far greater than the Hive, far greater than the machines and the toil. He was part of something vast and ancient, something that had been forgotten by all but the most faithful. The Emperor was awakening, and with it, the very fate of humanity would change. Malcus felt the stirrings of hope and terror, both rising in his chest at the same time. He could feel the weight of what was to come, the magnitude of the transformation that was unfolding. The machines around him began to hum louder, a strange energy filling the air. Malcus could feel it vibrating through his bones, through every fiber of his being. His heart raced as the realization sank in. Something was about to happen, something that would forever alter the course of history. And Malcus would be at the center of it all. The air in the Hive city had changed, thick with tension, as though every molecule was vibrating with the presence of something powerful and ancient. The tremors that had rumbled through the vast industrial complex were not just random malfunctions, no, they were something else entirely. They were the first signs, the heralds of a monumental event, an event Malcus could feel in his very soul, an event that was awakening forces beyond his comprehension. He stood motionless, his hands gripping the edges of the station, staring into the abyss of the Hive. Around him, the workers continued their tasks with eerie dispassion, as though they hadn't noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. They were slaves to the system, chained to their duties, their minds numbed by years of servitude. They were nothing more than extensions of the Hive's machinery, and they would remain so forever, unless something drastic changed. But Malcus wasn't like them anymore. For the first time in his life, he felt the stirrings of something within him, something more than just the endless grind of his existence. The flicker of defiance that had ignited in his mind was now a raging fire, burning away the layers of apathy and fear that had kept him bound to the Hive for so long. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. The voice, the call, the tremors, they weren't just signs of a malfunction. They were the echoes of something vast and incomprehensible, a force beyond his control. In the distance, he could hear the distant rumblings of the Hive World, the sound of its sprawling industries grinding into overdrive. It was a mechanical heart, beating relentlessly in the shadows, but now there was a new pulse beneath it, a pulse of power, of something that was awakening after centuries of slumber. The Emperor was waking. Malcus's heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. The Emperor, that legendary figure who had ruled the Imperium of man for millennia, was not just a godlike figure worshipped by billions, he was a reality. The Emperor was a force that transcended the very fabric of the Imperium, and now, in this moment, that force was stirring. Malcus couldn't fully grasp the scope of it, but he knew, deep in his bones, that everything was about to change. He looked around, trying to make sense of the chaos that was unfurling in his mind. The other workers continued their endless tasks, oblivious to the world-shattering change that was unfolding around them. But Malcus couldn't ignore it. He couldn't go back to the way things were. There was too much at stake now. The voice had called to him, had awoken something inside him, and there was no going back. The reality of his existence had always been defined by the Hive, by the cold, impersonal machinery that surrounded him. The workers were nothing but tools, cogs in the great machine of the Imperium. But now, as the Emperor's awakening shook the very foundations of the Hive, Malcus could no longer ignore the uncomfortable truth that had been buried deep within him for so long. He was more than just a worker. He was part of something greater, something vast, and the Emperor's return meant that his place in that vastness would no longer be defined by the mind-numbing labor of the Hive. "Malcus!" The shout came from behind him, jerking him out of his reverie. It was Brother Magnus again, his one good eye glaring at him with annoyance. Magnus was one of the oldest workers in the hive, a veteran of countless years spent in the same grueling conditions. Like all the others, Magnus had long since abandoned any dreams of escape or revolution. He had accepted his place in the great machine, and to him, it was nothing more than a fact of life. "What is it now?" Magnus growled, his voice low and irritated. Malcus turned, barely noticing the sneer on the older worker's face. He wanted to explain, to say that something profound had happened, that the Emperor was waking, that the hive would never be the same again, but the words caught in his throat. He could see it in Magnus's eyes. The older worker would never understand. The chains that held Magnus in place were too strong, too deeply embedded in his soul. I'm fine," Malcus muttered, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. It wasn't fine. He was far from fine. But there was no way to explain the storm that was raging inside him. The thoughts, the doubts, the awareness, none of it could be understood by those still bound by the hive. Magnus grunted, apparently satisfied with the answer. "Get back to work. The overseers will be here soon. They don't take kindly to distractions." Malcus nodded absently, but his thoughts were far from the task at hand. He was no longer focused on fixing the machines, no longer concerned with the endless grind of the work. His mind was racing, spinning with the enormity of what was happening. The Emperor, the great ruler of mankind, was returning. But what did that mean for someone like Malcus, a simple worker in the depths of the hive? The voice had said, "You are more than this." Malcus had always believed that his life had been predetermined. He had been born into the hive, and he would die there. That was the way of things. The Imperium was built on sacrifice, on the back of workers like him. It was a harsh reality, but it was a reality that had been drilled into him since birth. There was no escape from it. The hive was his prison, and he was its prisoner. But now, the very fabric of that reality was beginning to unravel. He had felt it in the tremors, in the voice that had called to him, in the energy that seemed to pulse through the hive itself. This was no ordinary event. This was the return of a god. The Emperor was waking, and the power that had been locked away for 10,000 years was stirring, and Malcus was caught in its wake. A choice in the dark. The hours dragged on, and the hive seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing minute. The hum of machinery, the clanging of metal, the endless grinding of the factory, it was all so familiar, so suffocating. But Malcus could no longer pretend that this was all there was to life. He had felt the stirring of something greater, something that called to him from beyond the walls of the hive. As the shift ended and the workers began to filter out of the factory, Malcus lingered behind, staring at the massive machines that surrounded him. They were still, silent now, as if even they were waiting for something. The faint tremors had stopped, but the air still felt charged with an energy that he couldn't explain. The entire hive seemed to be holding its breath. He had heard the stories of the Emperor, of the great crusade that had united humanity, of the war that had shaped the galaxy. But those stories had always seemed distant, like the whispers of ancient myths. The Emperor had been dead, entombed in the Golden Throne, a god worshipped by billions but unreachable, beyond the grasp of those like Malcus. The Imperium had become a hollow shell of what it once was. The Hive Worlds, with their millions of workers, had become little more than factories, turning out the raw materials needed to fuel the Imperium's endless wars. But the Emperor was not dead. He was waking. Malcus walked through the shadowed passages of the hive, his feet dragging, as though every step he took through the cold metal floors weighed heavier than the last. The dull echo of his boots was the only sound that dared break the silence. The workers who had passed him earlier had long since disappeared into the sprawling labyrinth of the hive, retreating to their quarters, to their sleep, a sleep that was as much an escape as it was a temporary respite from the crushing monotony of their existence. But Malcus couldn't sleep. His mind was restless, torn by the weight of what he had learned, what he had heard. The Emperor was waking. It wasn't just a whisper now. It wasn't just an idle thought. Malcus could feel it, the stirring of something ancient, something far greater than anything the hive had ever known. He had felt the tremors, heard the voice in his mind, and for the first time in his life, he had felt truly alive. Alive with purpose, with the flicker of possibility that stretched far beyond the suffocating walls of the hive. But now that he had tasted the forbidden truth, there was no going back. He couldn't unhear the voice, and he couldn't unsee the world for what it truly was. A prison, a machine built on the backs of the oppressed, its gears turning without a thought for those who powered it. For the workers, the realization came crashing down on him. The Hive World, his entire existence, it was all a lie. Or, more accurately, a distortion of what it could have been. The Imperium, with its endless war and its hollow promises, had twisted the very idea of humanity's potential. The Emperor's great dream, his vision of a united, free humanity, had become a cruel parody of itself. Malcus could feel the anger rising in his chest, hot and bitter. All these years he had worked without question, without hesitation, because he had been taught that it was his duty. The Imperium had taught him that there was no greater purpose than to serve, no higher calling than to give his life in the name of survival. And yet, all the while, the truth had been buried. The Emperor's vision was not what he had been told. It was not a promise of salvation, it was a trap of endless servitude, a promise of empty glory that had long since been abandoned. He could no longer deny the anger that burned in his gut. He had seen the truth now. The Emperor was not the god the Imperium made him out to be. He was a broken, tortured shell of a man, imprisoned on the Golden Throne, forced to sacrifice his humanity for the survival of an empire that had long since lost its way. The Emperor, the once great father of mankind, had become a figurehead, a symbol of an Imperium that no longer followed his ideals. But the voice, the call, it had spoken to Malcus. The Emperor was waking, and with his awakening, the world would change. No longer would the workers of the Hive be shackled to the gears of the Imperium. No longer would they serve a dying vision. Something new was coming, something different, something that could restore humanity to the path that had been lost. For the first time in his life, Malcus felt the weight of the decision he had to make. He could ignore it. He could return to his work, bury his anger and his newfound awareness, and let the Imperium continue on its path of decay. He could do what all the others did, fall back into the mindless grind, accept the pain and suffering as his fate, and hope that someday it would end. The Hive was his home, after all. It was the only world he knew. But something deep inside him told him that it wasn't enough, that the pain, the suffering, the endless labor, it wasn't meant to be his life. The more Malcus thought about it, the more it became clear. He could no longer live in the shadow of the Imperium's lies. He had to know the truth, the real truth. What had happened to the Emperor? What had happened to the dream of humanity's future? He had to find out. The door to a new reality. Malcus had never ventured far from the core sectors of the Hive. The workers were confined to the depths, the lower levels, where the factories and the smelting pits stood in constant operation, spewing fumes and casting shadows over the lives of those who worked in them. The upper levels of the Hive were reserved for the elite, the ruling classes, the overseers who ensured that the machinery of the Imperium kept running smoothly. But for someone like Malcus, someone of his station, the upper levels were little more than myth. Yet the voice had called him. It had stirred something inside him, something he couldn't ignore. Now he had a choice. He could stay within the confines of the Hive, where everything was familiar, where everything was predictable. Or he could venture beyond the walls, beyond the confines of the worker's existence, and seek answers. Seek the truth about the Emperor. Seek the truth about the Imperium. He knew the risks. The overseers would never allow him to wander freely. Those who dared question the Hive's authority, those who sought the truth outside the boundaries set by the Imperium, didn't last long. They were either silenced or disappeared, their names erased from history, as if they had never existed. But Malcus had made his decision. The world as he had known it no longer made sense. The truth was out there, and he couldn't ignore it, not anymore. With resolve steeling his heart, Malcus made his way to the hidden tunnels beneath the Hive. These tunnels were known only to the workers who had grown tired of the endless grind, the ones who sought escape. They were dangerous, full of forgotten corners and ancient relics of the Hive's past. But they were also a way out, his way out. The further he walked, the more the weight of the Hive seemed to lift from his shoulders. The oppressive walls, the constant hum of industry, they all seemed to fade into the background as he ventured deeper into the heart of the Hive. There were no overseers down here, no enforcers, only silence, only the echo of his footsteps. Malcus didn't know how far he would go. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer a worker. He had become something else, something greater. The voice had called to him, and he would follow it. A glimpse into the void. The tunnels were a maze, winding through the bowels of the Hive like the veins of a dying beast. They were old, forgotten, and long since abandoned by the Imperium's oversight. The further Malcus ventured, the more he felt as though he was stepping into another world, one that had been hidden away, buried beneath the surface of the Hive city, for reasons he didn't yet understand. As he pressed forward, he passed rusted doors and broken machinery, remnants of a time when the Hive had been a more vibrant, thriving place. Now, it was a shadow of its former self, a hollow husk that continued to function only because it had to. It had been built to last forever, but even the most enduring creations eventually succumbed to decay. Malcus's thoughts returned to the Emperor, to the voice that had called out to him. What would it mean if the Emperor truly awoke? What would become of the Hive, of the Imperium, if the very foundations of the Empire were shattered? He didn't know, but that was the point. He needed to know. He had to see it for himself. And as the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty tunnels, Malcus knew that he was on the edge of something far greater than himself. The question was no longer what he would find. The question was whether he was ready for what the truth would reveal. The voice had told him that he was more than this. But what did that mean? What did it mean for a worker like Malcus, who had spent his entire life toiling in the shadow of the Imperium? Could he be something more? Could he change his fate? As he stepped into the shadows of the Hive's lower levels, Malcus knew that there was only one way to find out. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he felt something stirring within him, something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The Emperor was waking, and the galaxy would change. Malcus had no idea where his path would lead, but he knew, deep in his soul, that he could no longer be the worker he had always been. Malcus's journey through the forgotten tunnels of the Hive felt like an endless descent into the abyss. The deeper he ventured, the more the walls around him seemed to press in, as if the Hive itself were conspiring to keep him contained, to trap him within its depths. But he refused to stop. The further he went, the more the world above him, the hum of industry, the grind of machinery, the crushing monotony of worker life faded into something distant, something unreachable. Here, in the forgotten bowels of the Hive, he felt a strange sense of freedom. It was a freedom born of defiance, of rejecting the life that had been laid out for him. His hands, once used to the mechanical routine of the factory, now gripped the walls of the tunnels as if they were the chains that had bound him. Every step he took felt like a step away from the life that had once seemed so inescapable. The tunnels twisted and turned, an endless maze of metal and decay. Some of the walls were scorched, as though they had been burned by something that had passed through long ago. Others were covered in strange symbols, markings that Malcus didn't understand, but could feel in his bones were important, ancient, forgotten truths. They were whispers from a time before the Hive, before the workers, before the Imperium had swallowed up everything in its path. But Malcus wasn't here for the ancient symbols. He wasn't here for the history. He was here for the truth, the secret of the Golden Throne. Hours passed, maybe more. Malcus couldn't tell. The Hive had no concept of day or night. It was a perpetual grind, an endless cycle. He had lost track of how far he had gone, how deep he had descended. His thoughts were clouded with a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. Each step was a step toward an unknown fate. The Emperor was waking. Malcus could feel it in his bones, in the very air that now seemed to vibrate with something greater than the buzz of industry. Then, just when he thought he could go no further, he saw it. At the end of the tunnel, there was a door ancient and covered in dust. the metal darkened by time. It stood out from the rest of the tunnel, as though it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for him. His breath caught in his throat as he approached it. His fingers, trembling, brushed against the cold surface of the door. It was heavy, imposing, and marked with the same strange symbols that had adorned the walls of the tunnels. There was no mistaking it. The door was old, far older than anything in the hive, and it was here for a reason. Malcus had no idea what lay behind it, but he knew he had to open it. His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the door's handle. It was surprisingly warm to the touch, as though it had been waiting for him. A low hum resonated beneath his fingertips, sending a shiver up his spine. The hum was the same as the one that had filled the hive when the voice had called to him. The voice of the Emperor. With a deep breath, he pulled the door open. Beyond it lay a room like no other he had ever seen. It was vast, cavernous, with walls made of some dark, reflective material that Malcus couldn't identify. There were no machines here, no industrial equipment, just silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence filled with power, with ancient, incomprehensible forces. At the center of the room was a pedestal. Upon it lay something, or rather, someone covered in a tattered cloth. Malcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he approached the pedestal. The air seemed to grow thicker around him, as though the very presence of what lay there was bending the space around him. He reached out, his hands trembling as they pulled the cloth away. And there, in the dim light of the cavern, lay a figure, a man, but not just any man. This was a figure of legend, a figure who had been whispered about in the stories of workers like Malcus, the Emperor. But he was not what Malcus had imagined. The Emperor was not a god, not a shining paragon of virtue. He was something else entirely. His body was withered, decayed by time and suffering, but his eyes, those eyes were still alive. They were alive in a way that no mortal's eyes should be. They burned with an intensity that pierced through Malcus's very soul, as though they could see into the deepest recesses of his being. The Emperor's face was gaunt, his skin pale and drawn, but there was a power within him that transcended his physical form. He was still alive, still burning with the will to shape the galaxy. Malcus staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had expected a god, a figure of unquestionable power, but what he found was something far more human, someone who had endured unimaginable suffering, someone whose very existence was bound by a cruel fate. "You have come, worker." The Emperor's voice rang out in Malcus's mind, low and resonant, as if it were not spoken, but felt deep in the very marrow of his bones. "You have come to witness the truth." Malcus's legs trembled beneath him. The truth? What truth? The Emperor had been lost to time, imprisoned in the Golden Throne for millennia. What could he possibly mean? "The truth, Malcus, is that the Imperium is a lie." The words pierced Malcus's mind like a spear. "The Imperium that you have served, that you have labored for, is not the dream I once envisioned. It is a machine built on sacrifice, on suffering. It was never meant to be this way. I was never meant to be this way." Malcus felt a cold shiver run through him. The Emperor was speaking of something terrible, something that had been hidden away for so long. The horror of it was almost too much to bear. The Imperium was built on the back of a dream, but that dream had been twisted into something monstrous. "I have slept for too long," the Emperor continued, his voice filled with a grief that Malcus had not thought possible from a being such as this. "I have watched as my dream was perverted by those who would use my name to justify their cruelty. I have watched as my people turned to superstition, to faith, to falsehoods, and now I awaken to find that the Imperium I built is no longer my own." Malcus fell to his knees, the weight of the Emperor's words crushing him. He had been raised to believe in the Emperor as a god, as an immortal force who had saved humanity from the brink of destruction. But what the Emperor was saying, it shattered everything Malcus had known. The Imperium was not the salvation of mankind. It was a lie, a system of control that had corrupted the very ideals it had once stood for. "I will not let this continue." The Emperor's voice rang out, powerful and commanding. "I will remake this galaxy. I will tear down the Imperium as it is and rebuild it. The truth will rise, Malcus, and those who are worthy will stand with me." The room seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as if the very air itself had come alive in the presence of the Emperor. Malcus knelt before the decayed figure, his hands trembling, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind was in turmoil, struggling to comprehend what he had just learned. The voice that had called to him, the Emperor's presence, it was more than he had ever imagined. It was a power that twisted the very fabric of reality around it, and Malcus could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. For so long, he had been nothing more than a worker, a cog in the machine of the Hive World. He had lived and died in the service of the Imperium, his life devoted to the relentless cycle of labor that powered the galaxy's war machine. But now, with the Emperor's words echoing in his mind, Malcus understood that everything he had known, everything he had believed, was a lie. The Imperium was not the salvation of mankind. It was a prison built on suffering, oppression, and the manipulation of the very ideals it was supposed to protect. The Emperor had not created the Imperium to enslave humanity. It had been twisted by those who followed him, who took his dream and distorted it into a machine of endless war and blind faith. The weight of the Emperor's truth crushed Malcus's chest, and he felt the tears springing to his eyes. He had believed in the Emperor, in the glory of the Imperium. But that was before he had learned the truth that the Emperor had once sought to free humanity from its chains, to build a future of reason, enlightenment, and freedom. And now, the Emperor was awake, but the world he had once dreamed of was long gone. Malcus struggled to his feet, his body trembling with the realization of what he had learned. The Emperor was still here, still alive, imprisoned on the golden throne, kept alive only by the sacrifice of countless souls. And now, after millennia of suffering, he was finally awakening, but not to bring salvation. No, the Emperor's awakening was not a herald of hope. It was the beginning of something far darker, something that could tear the very fabric of the Imperium apart. The Emperor's will, the Emperor's eyes, those piercing, burning eyes, fixed on Malcus with an intensity that made him feel small. Like an insect under the gaze of a predator, Malcus felt exposed, vulnerable. Yet there was something in those eyes that he couldn't ignore. They were not just eyes of power, they were eyes filled with sorrow, with regret, with the weight of centuries of betrayal. "You understand now, don't you, Malcus?" The Emperor's voice reverberated through Malcus's mind, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of authority. "The Imperium I created is a mockery of my vision, a twisted reflection of what humanity could have become. The lies, the faith, the fanaticism, all of it must be torn down. Humanity cannot ascend if it remains shackled by the chains of superstition." Malcus swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. The truth was too overwhelming. How could one man, one worker, understand the scale of what was happening? How could he possibly comprehend the full weight of the Emperor's words? "You have the power to make a choice, Malcus," the Emperor continued, his voice softening, though still filled with the weight of infinite knowledge. "You are more than a worker, more than a cog in the machine. You have been called for a reason." Malcus looked at the Emperor, his mind racing with questions. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The truth," the Emperor said, "is that humanity's future lies in your hands. The Imperium's foundations are rotten, its leaders corrupt, but there are still those who remain worthy. There are those who still cling to the ideals I once fought for." Malcus's heart pounded in his chest. Could it be true? Could there still be hope for humanity? Could the Emperor, in his broken form, still offer the salvation that so many had prayed for? "But I am only one man," Malcus whispered. "What can I do?" "You are not alone," the Emperor replied. "There are others who, like you, have awoken to the truth. You must find them. Together, you will shape the future of mankind. But first, you must leave the Hive. You must leave this place of falsehoods, of decay, and step into the galaxy. The Imperium will try to stop you. They will send their agents, their enforcers, to silence you. But you will be prepared." Malcus's mind spun as the weight of the Emperor's words began to sink in. The Imperium, the galaxy it was, all on the brink of collapse. The Emperor's awakening was not the end of mankind's suffering. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. He had been right to question his place in the hive. He had been right to seek the truth, but the truth came at a cost. The cost was the destruction of everything he had ever known. The path forward. Malcus stood in silence, trying to grasp the enormity of the choice that lay before him. The Emperor's voice was still echoing in his mind, urging him forward. He had seen the truth. He had seen the Emperor for what he truly was, a shattered god, a king who had been betrayed by his own creation. But there was still hope. There was still a chance for humanity to break free of the chains that had bound it for so long. The Emperor had chosen him for a reason. He had come to this moment, to this place, for a purpose that was far greater than himself. But it would not be easy. The Imperium would fight to maintain its grip on the galaxy. The forces of chaos, the enemies of mankind, would not sit idly by. And the loyalists who still clung to the false worship of the Emperor would not welcome a change. The road ahead would be treacherous, fraught with dangers both seen and unseen. Malcus felt a burning determination rise within him. He couldn't go back. There was no life for him in the hive, no place for him in the system that had consumed his soul for so long. He had a greater purpose now. "I will go," Malcus said, his voice firm. "I will find those who still believe in the Emperor's true vision. I will help rebuild what has been lost." The Emperor's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something like relief in his eyes. "Then go, Malcus, and know this. The future of humanity rests in your hands. Choose wisely, for the path ahead will not be an easy one." Malcus nodded, turning away from the Emperor's figure, feeling the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders. He had no choice but to step forward. The voice had called him. The Emperor had awoken, and now the fight for the soul of humanity was beginning. Malcus emerged from the forgotten tunnels of the hive, his mind still reeling from the Emperor's words. The Emperor's presence had faded, but the weight of the truth remained, gnawing at him like a relentless tide. Everything that had come before his life, his work, the imperceptible grind of existence, had been a mere shadow of the greater reality that he had just glimpsed. The air in the hive was heavy with the stench of industry, the familiar hum of the machines now sounding distant and hollow, like the last breath of a dying beast. Malcus walked through the narrow streets of the lower hive, his boots pounding the grimy ground with a steady rhythm, each step taking him farther from the life he had known. The workers around him, their faces blank and unreadable, paid him no mind. To them, Malcus was just another cog in the machine, just another man who would labor until his bones gave out. But Malcus was no longer that man. The Emperor had awoken, and with that awakening came a tidal wave of change. Malcus had seen the truth, and he had felt it stir within him, a power, a purpose, greater than anything he had ever imagined. The Emperor's dream, his vision of a united humanity, had been buried beneath centuries of corruption, twisted by those who had come to worship the very empire that had once been a beacon of hope. The Imperium was no longer the shining light it had once been. It had become a prison, a machine of war and oppression, built on the backs of the very people it claimed to protect. Malcus could not accept that. He would not accept it. The journey ahead would not be an easy one. The Imperium would fight to maintain its control. The forces of chaos, the enemies of mankind, would not sit idly by. And within the Imperium itself, there were those who had pledged their loyalty to the Emperor as a god, who would resist any change that threatened their power. But Malcus was resolute. He had heard the Emperor's voice. He had felt the weight of his words, and he had chosen to follow that path, to seek out the truth and help rebuild what had been lost. The first steps of rebellion. Malcus knew he couldn't do this alone. The Emperor had not chosen him by chance. He had been given a purpose, a task that was greater than anything he could have imagined in his previous life. The first step was clear. He needed to leave the hive, leave the confines of this prison, and seek those who still held on to the Emperor's true vision. But where to begin? The streets of the hive city stretched out before him like a maze, a labyrinth of metal and stone, each corner hiding secrets, each alleyway a dark promise of danger. But Malcus was no longer afraid. The truth had given him strength, a strength that he had never known. The workers around him, the overseers, the enforcers, none of them could hold him back. The Emperor had awoken, and the galaxy was on the verge of something far greater than any of them could comprehend. He made his way to the nearest transport hub, a sprawling network of railways that connected the Hive City to the rest of the planet. The train would take him to the upper levels, to the parts of the Hive that were reserved for the elite, for the ruling classes, for those who held the power. It was there, among the powerful and the privileged, that Malcus hoped to find his first ally. The journey was long, the train rattling through the dark tunnels beneath the surface of the planet. As he sat in the crowded car, surrounded by workers just like himself, Malcus couldn't help but wonder what had become of the Emperor's dream. Had it really been twisted so completely? Had humanity truly fallen so far from the path that the Emperor had envisioned? The train slowed as it approached the upper levels of the Hive, and the passengers began to shift uneasily in their seats. Malcus could feel the tension in the air. The upper levels were a different world entirely. The workers were not welcome there, not unless they were called upon by their masters to serve. As the train pulled into the station, Malcus stood and made his way to the exit. The doors slid open, and he stepped out into the bright, sterile light of the upper Hive. The air was cleaner here, free of the suffocating fumes that filled the lower levels, but it was no less oppressive. The upper Hive was a world of gleaming metal, of towering spires that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. It was a place of power, where the rich and the powerful lived in isolation, far removed from the suffering of the workers below. Malcus moved quickly, slipping through the crowds, blending in with the throngs of people who moved about their business with mechanical precision. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for signs of life, for those who might still believe in the Emperor's true vision. He had to find them. He had to learn the truth. The first meeting. It wasn't long before Malcus found the contact he had been looking for. She was standing at the corner of a bustling street, her dark robes contrasting sharply against the bright metal walls of the Hive. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but her posture was unmistakable. She was someone who had lived in the shadows, someone who understood the danger of what they were about to do. "Malcus," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I knew you would come." Although Malcus's heart skipped a beat as he approached her. He had no idea how she knew his name, but it didn't matter. She was here, and that was all that mattered. She was the first ally he had found, the first person to acknowledge the truth that had been buried beneath the surface of the Imperium. "Who are you?" Malcus asked, his voice low, his gaze scanning the street around them for signs of danger. "Does it matter?" the woman replied, her lips curling into a faint smile. "What matters is that I know what you're here for, Malcus, and I can help you." Malcus stepped closer, the weight of her words pressing down on him. She knew what he was seeking, she understood, and for the first time since hearing the Emperor's voice, Malcus felt a glimmer of hope. "I need to find those who still believe in the Emperor's true vision," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that still gnawed at him. "I need to rebuild what has been lost." The woman nodded. "You're not the only one. There are others like you, scattered across the galaxy. We have been waiting for someone to wake up, to hear the truth. The Emperor's will is not dead, Malcus, but it has been buried for far too long, and it's time to bring it back." Malcus felt his pulse quicken. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but it was a road he had no choice but to walk. The Emperor was awake, and the galaxy was about to change. "You'll need to be ready," the woman warned. "The Imperium will not let you go easily. There are those who still cling to the lie, and they will do whatever it takes to stop you. But you've already taken the first step, and there's no turning back now." Malcus nodded, his resolve hardening. The path ahead would be difficult, it would be dangerous, but it was the only path that mattered. The Emperor had awakened, and with that awakening came a choice, Malcus's choice, and he would not let that choice be taken from him. The city above was a stark contrast to the Hive below. Here, in the gleaming upper spires, everything was pristine, almost artificial in its perfection. Towers of metal and glass stretched toward the polluted sky, casting long shadows over the bustling streets below. It was a world of wealth and power, a world that seemed untouchable, as if the grime and suffering of the lower hive had been scrubbed clean from its surface. Malcus stood at the edge of the street, the woman who had introduced herself only as Sarah at his side. The crowds moved around them, oblivious to the two figures standing in the shadow of the Imperial spires. The air here was cleaner, tinged with the faint scent of chemicals and synthetic perfumes, but it carried a weight Malcus could not shake off. He could feel the eyes of the elite watching him, even if they did not look directly at him. There was a subtle, unspoken tension in the air, a sense that this place was a delicate facade, held up by the suffering of the lower levels. Sarah had led him to a hidden meeting place, far removed from the bustling streets. It was a small, unremarkable building tucked away in one of the back alleys. The walls were adorned with symbols that Malcus recognized, emblems of the old faith, the symbols of the Emperor's true vision. These were the remnants of a time long past, when the Emperor's dream had not been corrupted by the ambitions of his followers. The small gathering inside the building was quiet, their faces filled with a sense of purpose, their eyes reflecting the same fire that now burned within Malcus. Sarah stepped forward, her voice low but firm as she addressed the group. "Malcus has come. He is one of us now." Her words sent a ripple through the room, and Malcus could feel the eyes of the group turn to him. Some regarded him with curiosity, others with skepticism. They had heard rumors of a worker who had come to question the very foundations of the Imperium, but seeing him in person made it real. Malcus took a deep breath, standing tall despite the weight of their gaze. He had come here for a reason. The Emperor's voice still echoed in his mind, urging him forward. The Imperium, as it had been, was doomed, but there was hope. Hope that the Emperor's true vision could still be realized, if only those who still believed could rise and fight. He had no illusions about the road ahead. It would be dangerous, filled with opposition from every corner of the galaxy, but it was a road he had no choice but to walk. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something greater than himself. "I've heard your stories," Malcus said, his voice carrying the weight of his newfound conviction. "The Emperor has awoken, but not in the way we imagined. The Imperium is not what it was meant to be. It is a machine, a tool of war, built on the suffering of its people. I have seen the truth, and now I must ask you, do you believe in the Emperor's vision? Do you believe that humanity can be freed from the chains that have bound it for so long?" Sarah's eyes flickered with recognition, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "We do," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of secrecy. "We've waited for this moment, for the day when someone would rise up, someone who still believed in the true Emperor's dream, the one who would remind us of what we were meant to be." There was a murmur of agreement from the group. Some of them nodded, their expressions resolute, while others remained silent, unsure of what to expect. But in that room, in that moment, Malcus felt the first true spark of rebellion. This was where it began. It was not just a fight against the corrupt institutions of the Imperium. It was a fight for the soul of humanity itself. It was a fight for the future that the Emperor had once envisioned, one of reason, enlightenment, and unity, not blind faith and war. Sarah moved to the center of the room, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered. "The Imperium is falling apart, the leadership is corrupt, and the people have been forgotten. But we can change that. We can restore the Emperor's dream. The first step is simple. We must take back control. We must start with the heart of the Imperium, the institutions that hold it together. If we are to succeed, we must unite the people, awaken them to the truth, and tear down the false worship that has consumed them for so long." Malcus nodded, his thoughts aligning with hers. He had no doubt that the task would be monumental. The Imperium was a vast empire, built over millennia, its structures deeply entrenched in the fabric of the galaxy. The people of the Imperium had been taught to worship the Emperor as a god, and to question that was to risk everything. But the Emperor himself had shown Malcus the way. The path to true change lay in the destruction of the lies that had shackled humanity. The Imperium could not survive as it was. It had to be remade, rebuilt from the ground up. "Where do we start?" Malcus asked, his voice steady now, the fire in his chest burning brighter than ever. Sarah's eyes narrowed, and she gestured to the small group gathered around the room. "We begin here. We begin by uniting those who still believe, those who still remember what the Emperor stood for. The rest will follow." She paused, as if weighing her next words carefully. "But we will need more than just words. The Imperium's enforcers, the Adeptus Custodes, the Inquisition, they will come for us. We must be ready. Our movement must remain hidden until the moment is right." Malcus could feel the weight of her words, the truth that lay beneath them. The forces of the Imperium would not let them rise without a fight. The Custodes, the Emperor's own protectors, would see them as heretics, traitors to the Imperium's sacred cause. And the Inquisition, the secret police of the Imperium, would stop at nothing to root them out. But Malcus didn't hesitate. He had already seen too much to turn back now. "We'll need allies," Malcus said, his voice firm. "We'll need support from within the Imperium itself. We can't do this alone." Sarah nodded. "And we will find them. There are those who still hold to the true ideals of the Emperor. They are scattered across the galaxy, but they are not unreachable. We will make contact, slowly, carefully, and when the time comes, we will strike." Malcus felt a surge of purpose, a deep, unshakable resolve. This was the beginning, the first step in a long journey. He knew that there would be dangers ahead, challenges that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine, but he had no choice. The galaxy was falling into chaos, and only by embracing the true vision of the Emperor could humanity hope to survive. As he stood there, in the hidden chamber beneath the upper hive, with the whispers of rebellion growing louder around him, Malcus felt something stir within him, something that had been absent for far too long. Hope. The Imperium would not fall, not if he had any say in it, and he would not let the Emperor's dream be twisted into a nightmare. Days turned into weeks, as Malcus and his newfound allies in the hidden chambers of the upper hive began to lay the groundwork for their rebellion. The deeper he ventured into this clandestine movement, the clearer it became that they were not just fighting to reshape the Imperium, they were fighting for the soul of humanity itself. The Emperor had shown them the truth, and now it was their responsibility to spread that truth across the galaxy. Malcus found himself increasingly torn between the two worlds he had known. The Hive City, with its cold machinery and the unyielding grind of labor, was no longer a place he could return to with the same blind acceptance. But he could not yet escape it, not without making the necessary preparations. The fight ahead would be unlike anything he had ever imagined, and he knew he could not do it alone. In the heart of the upper hive, in a forgotten meeting hall hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and elite arrogance, Sarah and the others began their work. There were whispers of those still loyal to the Emperor's true vision, scattered across the Imperium like seeds waiting to be planted. But finding them would be a delicate matter. They couldn't trust just anyone. Malcus and Sarah, along with a few others, began to gather their small but growing movement. Some were disillusioned members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, others former Imperial guardsmen who had seen the Emperor's vision twisted into something unrecognizable. The Inquisition, too, had its defectors, those who had begun to see through the lies that had kept humanity in chains. But Malcus had learned quickly that this was no simple task. It was one thing to speak of the Emperor's truth in a hidden chamber far from the prying eyes of the ruling class, but it was quite another to confront the full weight of the Imperium's might. And as Malcus began to understand, there were powers in the galaxy far greater than the Imperium itself, powers that were waking up alongside the Emperor. The forces of chaos, the ancient enemies of mankind, were not idle. They, too, felt the Emperor's return, and they would stop at nothing to prevent his true will from being realized. The first encounter, the first sign that the movement had been discovered, came one quiet evening, as Malcus and Sarah were preparing for another covert meeting. The group had grown in size, the whispers of rebellion spreading slowly, cautiously across the Hive World. But that evening, as the dim light of the subterranean chambers flickered, the unmistakable sound of boots pounding the ground echoed from the entrance. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that did not belong to their allies. Malcus felt his heart skip a beat, and his hand instinctively went to the hilt of his knife, the only weapon he had on him. Sarah's expression darkened, and she moved silently toward the back of the room, signaling for the others to stay low. The group, now standing in the shadows, barely breathed as the footsteps grew louder. It wasn't long before the door burst open, revealing a group of armed men, enforcers, their dark armor gleaming with the insignia of the Adeptus Arbites. The familiar sigils of the Imperium's symbols of justice were emblazoned on their chests. They were here for one purpose only: to silence dissent. The Emperor's true vision had become a crime in the eyes of the Imperium's enforcers, and Malcus knew they would stop at nothing to quash any rebellion. "Where is the heretic?" the lead enforcer shouted, his voice deep and commanding. "By the authority of the Imperium, we demand that you surrender." The room was silent. The movement had worked in the shadows for so long, it was not yet prepared for this. The truth, it seemed, had found them first. Malcus stepped forward, his pulse quickening but his resolve steady. He knew that the time for hiding was over. If they were to survive to fight back, they had to make a stand. The enforcers were many, and their loyalty was unquestioned, but Malcus had seen enough to know that the Imperium was not the ideal he had once believed. The truth was clear now. "We are not heretics," Malcus said, his voice calm, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. "We are the truth, and the truth will not be silenced any longer." The enforcer sneered, his weapon raised. "You speak of truth, but it is heresy to speak against the Emperor's will. You are nothing more than traitors, and you will be punished as such." Sarah's voice, low but filled with unyielding conviction, echoed behind Malcus. "We serve the Emperor's true vision. You serve the lies of the Imperium, and for that, we will not be cowed." The tension in the room was palpable. Malcus could hear the faint clicks of weapons being readied. He knew that if they resisted, the consequences would be dire. But the truth they carried, the Emperor's true will, was something worth fighting for. It was something worth dying for. And so, with a single, determined breath, Malcus made his choice. The clash. The room erupted into chaos. The enforcers moved swiftly, their weapons drawn, their training honed for such a moment. But Malcus was faster. He lunged toward the closest enforcer, his knife slicing through the air. The enforcer's reaction was swift, but not swift enough. Malcus's blade found its mark, and the enforcer crumpled to the ground with a grunt. The room filled with noise, the clash of metal against metal, the shouts of rebellion, and the cold, calculated commands of the enforcers. It was a battle unlike any Malcus had ever fought. This was no longer just a worker's struggle. This was the fight for the very future of humanity. Sarah moved like a shadow, her hands working with a speed and precision that left no room for error. Her blade was a blur, cutting down the enforcers with the grace of a predator hunting its prey. The others in the room, those who had pledged themselves to the Emperor's true vision, fought with the same relentless determination. They were not just defending themselves, they were defending a dream. In the heat of the chaos, Malcus felt something stir within him, a deep, undeniable strength. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the fight. It was something more, something that had been awakened by the Emperor's voice. The truth was with them, and the Imperium's enforcers, those who had sworn to uphold a system built on lies, could not stop them. The battle raged for only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the dust settled, the enforcers lay motionless on the ground, their once imposing armor now little more than a symbol of a dying system. The air was thick with the smell of blood and sweat, and the silence that followed was deafening. Malcus stood amidst the fallen, his breath heavy, but his heart light. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. The first battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. Sarah approached him, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "This is only the beginning, Malcus. The galaxy is vast, and the enemies of the truth are many. But we have shown that we will not be silenced. The Imperium will fall, but from its ashes, something better will rise." Malcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the bodies of the fallen enforcers. They had believed in the system, in the lies that had kept humanity in chains. But now, the truth was spreading, and with it, the hope that one day humanity would be free. The days following the confrontation with the enforcers were a blur of action, strategy, and quiet reflection. Malcus and the small group of rebels, who had once been shadows in the Hive's dark corridors, now found themselves thrust into the heart of a conflict that spanned the very soul of the Imperium. The truth that had been hidden for millennia, the Emperor's true vision, was now their weapon. But with that weapon came a burden, a responsibility that none of them had fully understood when they had first decided to act. The rebellion was no longer just a whisper in the dark corners of the Hive. It was becoming something greater, something that could no longer be ignored. Malcus knew that the true battle was not just in taking down the corrupt leaders of the Imperium. It was in dismantling the very foundations of a system that had enslaved humanity for thousands of years. And that would require more than just a few scattered cells of resistance. It would take a revolution, one that would reshape the galaxy itself. But even as their movement grew, so too did the resistance. The Imperium, though weakened, was vast. Its hold on the galaxy had been unshakable for millennia, and the agents of its oppression, be they the Adeptus Custodes, the Inquisition, or the countless other forces that maintained the Empire's iron grip, were not easily defeated. Malcus had seen the full might of the Imperium's machinery in action, but he had also seen the cracks forming within that machinery, cracks that could be widened and shattered by the right force. And that force, he realized, was not simply a weapon, it was an idea. It was the idea of a humanity freed from the chains of superstition and war. The idea that the Emperor's true vision had never been one of a godlike ruler, but a leader who sought to elevate humanity beyond its primitive roots, to bring about a future where humans would stand on their own merits, free from the shackles of blind faith and endless conflict. The gathering storm. Malcus stood on a balcony high above the sprawl of the Hive city, looking out over the sprawling landscape of metal and stone. The city stretched out before him like a living organism, teeming with life, but suffocating beneath the weight of its own corruption. Beneath him, the workers moved like ants, each one trapped in their own struggle, each one unaware of the greater battle that was unfolding around them. For the first time in his life, Malcus didn't feel trapped. He no longer felt like one of the millions of nameless faces lost in the churn of the Imperium's machinery. He had seen the truth, and with that truth came power, the power to change the future, to reshape the course of history. But with that power came an undeniable cost. The movement had gained traction, yes, but it was still fragile. The forces that opposed them were vast, and the Imperium's loyalists were not just going to roll over. There would be battles ahead, countless sacrifices, and countless lives lost. The road to reformation would be long, and it would be fraught with bloodshed. And yet, the fire that had been ignited within him was unshakable. The Emperor's voice still resonated in his mind, urging him forward. Malcus knew what had to be done. The Imperium had failed. The Emperor's dream had been corrupted, twisted by those who had chosen to worship power instead of wisdom, obedience instead of freedom. The dream of a united, enlightened humanity had been buried beneath centuries of war, fear, and false faith. It was time to reclaim that dream, a call to action. The rebellion's strength grew, slowly but surely. Malcus, Sarah, and their small band of allies moved in the shadows, gathering those who had been forgotten by the Imperium. They found former soldiers, disillusioned tech priests, even psychers who had been abandoned and used as tools of oppression. Slowly, their ranks swelled as word of their cause spread throughout the galaxy. The Imperium, in its blind arrogance, had underestimated them. They had thought that the whispers of rebellion would die in the dark corners of the galaxy, but they were wrong. As Malcus traveled from world to world, his resolve hardened. The movement wasn't just about tearing down the Imperium, it was about building something better, something new. And that meant awakening the masses, rousing them from the stupor of centuries of blind faith. Humanity's potential was limitless, if only it could be freed from the shackles of the false emperor worship. Every world they visited, every system they infiltrated, they left a mark. And each mark was a spark that set the galaxy ablaze. The Empire's great institutions, the ecclesiarchy, The Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Guard, began to fracture, splintered by the truth that Malcus and his allies spread like fire through dry wood. And where the Imperium tried to silence them, the fire only grew stronger. But Malcus knew the forces they were up against. The Imperium had its loyal legions, its unquestioning adherents, and the Emperor's true believers who would die before they allowed anyone to challenge their authority. The Inquisition had already begun hunting down the movement, sending agents into the farthest reaches of the galaxy to root them out. They would stop at nothing to quash this heresy, this rebellion against their god. Malcus and his allies were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched in every way. But they had the truth, and the truth, Malcus had learned, was far more powerful than any weapon. The final stand. The inevitable confrontation came sooner than Malcus had expected. As the movement grew bolder, so too did the Imperium's response. The forces of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own bodyguard, arrived in full force to quell the growing insurgency. They had come to reclaim the Hive cities, to crush the rebellion that had been fermenting beneath their noses. Malcus could feel the pressure mounting, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. They were prepared. But Malcus knew the battle would be more than just a physical one. It was a battle for the very future of mankind. The Custodes were not just soldiers, they were icons of the old order, embodiments of the false emperor worship that had corrupted the Imperium. To defeat them was not just to win a battle, it was to challenge the very foundation of everything the Imperium had built. The battlefield was set on the broken, polluted world of Warhammer 9, a planet scarred by centuries of war and industrial exploitation. It was here that Malcus and his allies would make their final stand. The cityscape was a ruin, a testament to the cost of the Imperium's endless war machine. As the Custodes descended from the sky, their golden armor gleaming, Malcus stood at the front of his army, an army of those who had long been forgotten. His heart beat in time with the pulse of the universe, and in that moment, he understood what had been driving him all along. It wasn't just the Emperor's voice, nor the truth of his vision. It was humanity's potential, the promise of what could be, if mankind was freed from the lies that had enslaved it for so long. The battle raged for hours, but Malcus's forces, though fewer in number, fought with an intensity that could not be matched. It was a battle not just for survival, but for the soul of mankind. The Custodes fought like gods, but in the end, they were still bound by the same flaws that had corrupted the Imperium. In the final moments of the battle, as the Custodes fell one by one, Malcus faced their leader, the Shield Captain, in a duel that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Their blades clashed in a storm of light and fury, but in the end, it was Malcus who stood victorious. With the Shield Captain's fall, the last symbol of the Emperor's false worship shattered, and with it, the last vestige of the Imperium's corrupted power crumbled. Malcus stood amidst the ruins, his chest heaving, the echoes of battle still ringing in his ears. The war was over. The Imperium had fallen, but it was not the end. It was the beginning. Epilogue, a new dawn. The galaxy was changing. The Imperium, as it had been, was no more. The truth had won. The Emperor's true vision, once buried beneath centuries of corruption, was now alive once again. Malcus, now a leader in the new order, stood on the threshold of a new era. An era where humanity could finally grow beyond the shackles of superstition and war, where reason and compassion would guide the way forward. The road ahead would be long. There would be resistance, there would be pain, and there would be sacrifices. But Malcus knew that this was the path humanity had always been meant to walk. The galaxy, once enslaved by the lies of the Imperium, was now free. And with that freedom came the greatest gift of all, the chance to build a future worthy of the sacrifices of those who had fought for it. As he looked out over the battlefield, the sun rising on a new world, Malcus whispered to himself, "The Emperor's dream is reborn." And with that, he knew that the future was theirs to shape. Together, they would build something better, something humanity had always been capable of. A new dawn had broken, and the stars themselves seemed to shine brighter.